My name is Defne. I'm 32 years old, and for the better part of a decade, my identical twin sister Selin has introduced me at every single family gathering as my sister. She's still figuring things out. That phrase, asterisk still figuring things out asterisk, has a specific texture when you hear it enough times. It starts as a simple descriptor, a bit of casual shorthand between sisters. But over years, repeated at birthdays and weddings and holiday dinners, it calcifies into something harder, something that shapes not just how others see you but how you learn to see yourself, if you're not careful. I am careful. I've always been careful. Let me take you back to where this story really begins, because I think the full shape of what happened at that engagement party makes sense only if you understand the decades of silence that preceded it, the careful architecture of invisibility I built without quite realizing I was building anything at all. Selin and I were born 11 minutes apart in Izmir, on a humid August morning that my mother still describes as the day I got 2 daughters and one very long labor story. We arrived identical, pink and squalling, with the same dark hair and the same almond-shaped eyes that would later become our most remarked-upon feature. Our parents, my mother, a former schoolteacher who'd left the profession to raise us, and my father, who ran a small import-export brokerage out of an office in Connacht, had prepared for one baby, maybe 2 if they were lucky. They got 2, and they spent the first few years of our lives marveling at how different we already were. Selin was the loud one from the beginning. She cried louder, laughed earlier, and demanded attention with the fierce determination of someone who had arrived in the world knowing exactly what she wanted. By the time we were 4, she had already developed what our grandmother called the gift of the gab, an endless stream of chatter, questions, observations, and performances that captivated adults at every family gathering. She could make anyone laugh. She could charm anyone. She could get away with anything because, as our father used to say, Selin just has that spark. I was quieter. I don't remember making a conscious decision to be quiet. It was simply the shape my personality took in response to the world. I observed more than I participated. I listened more than I spoke. I read constantly, devouring books at a rate that worried my teachers, who'd send notes home suggesting I was too solitary and might benefit from more group activities. I remember one of those notes specifically because my mother showed it to me with a worried expression, and I looked at her and said, "I just like reading more than I like talking to people who don't have anything interesting to say." She'd laughed, uncertainly, and I'd gone back to my book. Our father, Seymour, was the one who understood me best. He ran his import-export business with the methodical patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed the mechanics of commerce, the way shipping contracts worked, how currency exchange rates affected pricing, why some deals fell apart at the last minute and others didn't. He loved explaining these things, and I loved asking questions about them. From the time I was 8 or 9, I'd sit in his home office, perched on a stool beside his desk, while he walked me through his latest negotiation. He never simplified things for me, never talked down to me the way adults often talk to children who ask too many questions. He answered each question directly, honestly, and then waited for the next one. I think that's where my understanding of business really began, not in a classroom, not in a textbook, but in that small office in Izmir, watching my father navigate the complex world of international trade with a calm, steady competence that I'd later recognize as the mark of someone who genuinely knew his craft. He wasn't a wealthy man by any standard, but he was competent, respected, and most importantly, he never stopped learning. I inherited that from him, I think. The instinct to keep asking questions, keep understanding how things worked, even when the answers got complicated. Selin, meanwhile, was thriving in her own way. She was popular at school, surrounded by friends, the kind of teenager who could walk into any room and immediately command attention. She dated early and often, had her first serious boyfriend at 16, and spent her weekends at parties and social gatherings that I had no interest in attending. She was the bright star of our family's social life, the daughter everyone asked about first, the one who made our parents proud in the visible, public ways that families seemed to value most. I was the daughter who stayed in her room reading, or in my father's office asking questions about import tariffs and exchange rates, or later, when I got older, tutoring other students in math and economics because I discovered that explaining things to others helped me understand them better myself. The family settled somewhere around the time we were 12 into a story about the two of us that neither of us had actually chosen, and that neither of our parents ever seriously examined. Selin was the people person. I was the quiet one. Selin would go far because she knew how to work a room. I was thoughtful and such a good student, but there was always a slight shrug after those descriptions, a subtle suggestion that being a good student wasn't quite the same as being someone who'd actually succeed in the world. By the time we reached university, the narrative had taken on a life of its own. Selin studied communications at a well-regarded university in Istanbul, choosing the path that would lead naturally to the kind of public-facing career she was clearly destined for. She thrived in that environment, surrounded by ambitious young people who shared her appetite for networking, visibility, and social success. She graduated with honors, landed a position at a respected PR firm, and began climbing steadily into the kind of mid-level corporate role that looked impressive on paper and even more impressive at family gatherings. I chose a different path. I studied finance and economics at a university in Ankara, the kind of rigorous program that attracted students who were serious about understanding the mechanics of how money actually moved through the world. I loved it, loved the precision, the logic, the way that finance was ultimately about understanding human behavior at scale, about predicting how people would act based on the incentives they faced. I devoured case studies, spent hours in the library reading about mergers and acquisitions, and developed a particular fascination with the world of private equity, the way that patient, strategic capital could transform struggling businesses into something profitable, the way that smart restructuring could save jobs and create value where others saw only failure. After graduation, I did something that nobody in my family fully understood or asked many follow-up questions about. I left for London to pursue a master's degree in finance at one of the top programs in Europe. My parents were supportive, but perplexed. "Why London?" my mother asked. "What's wrong with Turkey?" "Nothing's wrong," I said. "I just want to learn from people who've been doing this longer than anyone in Turkey has." She nodded, not quite understanding, and went back to her concerns about whether I'd be warm enough, whether I'd eat properly, whether I'd meet the right people. I didn't tell her that I was already starting to build the network I'd need for the career I was planning. I didn't tell her about the connections I was making with professors who'd worked on some of the most significant private equity deals in European history. I didn't tell her about the internships I was applying for, the interviews I was scheduling, the careful, deliberate work I was doing to position myself exactly where I needed to be. Selin, predictably, had thoughts. She visited me in London once, during my second year, and spent most of the trip remarking on how cheerful my tiny flat was. It was not, how brave I was to live alone in a city so far from home. I was not brave. I was just doing what needed to be done. And how she could never do what I was doing, which I understood to be a way of saying she didn't want to do what I was doing, which was fine, because I wasn't asking her to. The pattern was established, fully formed, by the time I turned 25. Selin had her career, her apartment in a desirable neighborhood in Istanbul, her steady stream of interesting boyfriends. She was visible, successful, celebrated. I had my quiet life in London, my demanding job at a boutique private equity firm that nobody in my family could name, and a growing portfolio of deals that I couldn't discuss in detail anyway because of confidentiality agreements. I tried, a few times, to explain what I actually did for a living. I remember one particular evening at a family dinner, shortly after I'd been promoted to a senior analyst role. I'd flown back to Istanbul for my mother's birthday, and Selin had brought along her then-boyfriend, a nice enough man who worked in advertising and who seemed genuinely interested when I started to explain my work. "So you buy struggling companies?" he'd asked, leaning forward with apparent curiosity. "Like companies that are about to go bankrupt?" "Sometimes," I said. "Or companies that are just undervalued for other reasons, poor management, bad market positioning, that kind of thing. We find companies with solid fundamentals that are just not performing to their potential, and we acquire them, restructure them, and try to turn them around." "But what does that actually mean, though?" Selin had interrupted, her tone light, but with an edge I'd grown accustomed to. Like, you sit in an office and look at spreadsheets all day? Yes, I said. I sit in an office and look at spreadsheets all day. And occasionally I fly to Germany to visit a manufacturing plant that's losing money, or to Italy to meet with a management team that's about to be replaced, or to Paris to negotiate a restructuring deal with a bank syndicate that's trying to figure out how to recover its loans. Selin had laughed, not unkindly, but with the dismissive quality I'd learned to recognize. That sounds so boring, honestly. I don't know how you do it. Someone has to, I said. And that was the end of that conversation. My mother changed the subject to Selin's latest client campaign, my father nodded politely, and the moment passed into the rhythm of the evening. I'd told them what I did, more or less, and they'd listened more or less, and then they'd moved on to something more interesting. I stopped trying after that. I stopped explaining. I stopped offering details that nobody seemed particularly interested in hearing. I let the silence about my actual career fill in with whatever assumption was easiest for everyone else to make, which, over time, became, Defne moved abroad and is doing something with numbers, probably not very exciting, definitely not very lucrative, certainly nothing worth asking about twice. Somewhere around my late 20s, Selin started referring to me at family gatherings with a specific phrase that calcified into something close to an actual nickname, still figuring things out. She didn't say it cruelly, exactly. She said it the way you describe a sympathetic family member with an unremarkable situation, light, slightly pitying, the kind of phrase designed to sound generous while quietly establishing a hierarchy. "This is my sister Defne," she'd say, introducing me to a colleague or a new boyfriend's family. "She's still figuring things out, bless her. Lives in London. We're not totally sure what she does." I let it stand. For years. I want to be honest about why, because I think it's important and because I think the reason matters more than the eventual reveal. I let it stand because, frankly, what I actually did for a living involved a level of confidentiality that made correcting the narrative loudly almost impossible without breaching professional obligations I took extremely seriously. The specific fund I worked for and eventually became a partner at operated with the kind of discretion that private equity at that level requires, acquisitions structured through holding entities, deals that didn't make headlines under my actual name, the entire architecture of the work designed to be quiet rather than visible. I genuinely could not, even if I'd wanted to, sit my family down and produce a tidy explanation of my net worth or my professional standing, because so much of it lived inside structures that weren't built to be casually described over a holiday dinner. But there's a second reason, and I think it's the more honest one. I let it stand because I had, somewhere along the way, stopped needing my family's validation to know what I'd built. I had built a career, brick by brick, in rooms my family had never been invited into and wouldn't have understood even if they had been. I'd learned, the hard way in my 20s, that some people simply cannot hear certain truths about you until they encounter the truth directly, with their own eyes, in a form too undeniable to argue around. My family was, I came to believe, exactly that kind of audience. Telling Selin she was wrong about me would have produced an argument. Showing her would produce something else entirely. And there's a third reason, one that I didn't fully articulate to myself at the time, but that I understand now, looking back. A small, stubborn part of me wanted to see what would happen when the truth finally came out. I wanted to see Selin's face when she realized that the sister she'd been dismissing for a decade had actually built something significant. I wanted to see the exact moment of reckoning, and I wanted to see whether it would change anything. Selin got engaged about 8 months ago to a man named Barak. I want to be honest that I was genuinely happy for her. Whatever complicated feelings I had about the decade of still figuring things out comments, I never once wished her unhappiness in love, and Barak, from the brief interactions I'd had with him, seemed like a kind, grounded person, which is its own kind of relief when you're watching a sibling marry into serious money. Barak came from a wealthy Istanbul family that owned a chain of hotels along the Aegean coast. He was the youngest son, the one who'd been given the responsibility of managing the family's real estate holdings rather than the hotels themselves, because his older brothers had already claimed the more glamorous roles. He seemed to take this in stride, handling the management of several commercial properties with a quiet competence that reminded me, unexpectedly, of our father. He wasn't flashy or self-important. He just got things done efficiently and without fuss. I'd met him a handful of times before the engagement, always at family events where Selin was the center of attention, and I was the quiet sister in the corner. He'd always been polite, even kind, but I never got the sense that he'd given me much thought beyond the basic politeness of meeting your fiancé's family. Why would he? Selin had introduced me as still figuring things out, and he'd had no reason to question that description. The engagement party was planned to be enormous. 200 guests, a venue overlooking the Bosphorus, the full machinery of a wealthy Istanbul family's idea of how to announce a marriage to the world. Selin had been planning it for months, obsessing over every detail with the same intensity she'd brought to every major event in her life. The flowers had to be exactly right. The music had to be perfect. The food had to be from the best caterer in Istanbul, recommended by Barak's mother herself. That caterer was Lail Catering, run by a woman named Yasmin Tuzuan, who handled nearly every major society function in the city. Selin had been thrilled to secure her services, bragging about it at every family dinner leading up to the party. Yasmin Tuzuan, she'd say, drawing out the name the way you'd mention a celebrity. She doesn't take just anyone. You have to be on her list. Barak's mother personally made the introduction. I'd nodded politely each time, said, "That's wonderful, Selin," and let the conversation move on. I didn't mention that I'd met Yasmin Tuzuan before. I didn't mention that I'd actually sat across from her at a meeting in London about 2 years earlier, renegotiating the vendor agreement between her company and one of the portfolio businesses I oversaw. I didn't mention that our professional relationship had been entirely cordial, entirely professional, and entirely invisible to anyone who didn't need to know about it. What was the point? It would have just led to more questions I didn't want to answer, more explanations I was tired of giving. So I kept quiet as I'd always done, and I prepared myself for another evening of being the invisible sister at a party that was entirely about my sister's life. The evening started exactly the way I expected it to. I arrived in a deep emerald gown alone. I'd ended a long relationship about a year earlier and hadn't yet started seeing anyone seriously, a detail Selin had, predictably, mentioned to several relatives before I'd even walked in. Defne's still single too. I heard her say to a cousin near the entrance, in the same light, faintly pitying tone she'd perfected over a decade. She's very independent. Doesn't really need anyone, I guess. I found my parents, made the rounds of obligatory hellos with relatives I hadn't seen in years, and settled into the specific, practiced quiet I developed for events like this, present, polite, completely unbothered on the surface, while underneath I simply waited for the evening to end the way every other family gathering for the past decade had ended. The venue was spectacular, I'll give them that. A grand ballroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Bosphorus, the water glittering with the lights of passing ships. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across the room. Tables draped in white linen held elaborate floral arrangements that must have cost a small fortune. The guests were elegantly dressed, the champagne was flowing, and Selin was in her element, working the room with the effortless charm she'd always possessed. I watched her from a corner near the bar, nursing a glass of wine and making small talk with a distant aunt who asked, predictably, whether I was seeing anyone special. I deflected gracefully, asked about her grandchildren, and settled back into my accustomed role as the quiet observer, the one who was present but never quite central. About 2 hours into the party, during the dinner service, I noticed a woman in a black blazer moving briskly between tables with the focused energy of an event coordinator handling a logistics problem. She was holding a tablet and a printed contract, clearly trying to track down someone to resolve some issue, a vendor payment discrepancy, a last-minute change, the kind of small fire that always burns somewhere behind the scenes at events this size. She approached our table specifically because Selin, as the guest of honor, was the obvious point of contact for any event-related question, and she said, somewhat apologetically, that there was a billing discrepancy on the catering invoice tied to the venue's vendor agreement. Apparently a discount that was supposed to apply hadn't been reflected correctly. Something to do with a preferred partner rate negotiated under a holding agreement the venue had with one of its investors. I'm so sorry to bring this up tonight of all nights, the woman said, who I'd later learn was Yasmin Tizuan herself, the company's owner, personally checking on a high-profile event the way owners of businesses that size sometimes do for their most important clients. But the discount code on file references an entity called Iden Capital Partners, and I just need to confirm the relationship before I can apply it because our system flagged it as needing direct authorization from. She stopped mid-sentence. She had glanced down at the seating chart in her other hand, the one listing the guest of honor's immediate family by name, and then back up at me, and I watched the exact moment the two pieces of information collided in her mind. "Wait," she said slowly. "You're Defne Iden?" I said yes. "You're that Defne Iden? From Iden Capital? You sit on the board that holds the majority interest in our parent company. I met you once at the restructuring meeting 2 years ago. In London, you renegotiated our entire vendor agreement with this venue group personally. I didn't recognize you without." She gestured vaguely, flustered. "I'm so sorry. I just wasn't expecting to see you here at a family event. I had no idea you were related to." I want to describe Selin's face in that exact moment because I've thought about it many times since, and I don't think I'll ever fully capture how completely it transformed in under 5 seconds. She'd been half listening to the catering conversation the way you half listen to logistics talk you assume doesn't concern you, and then, somewhere in Yasmin's sentence, her own brain caught up to what was actually being said, and I watched the specific, total drain of color from her face, the look of someone realizing in real time in front of 200 people that the punchline she'd been delivering about her sister for a decade had just been revealed, publicly, to be completely, catastrophically wrong. "I'm sorry," Selin said, her voice noticeably smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Did you say board?" "She sits on a board. She's a managing partner," Yasmin said, still slightly flustered, clearly not yet understanding the social landmine she'd just detonated. Iden Capital holds a controlling position in 3 of our parent company's portfolio businesses. I assumed everyone here would know that, given. She stopped again, looking between us, finally registering the tension at the table. "I'm so sorry. I think I've said something I shouldn't have." The table had gone quiet in a particular way, not the polite, ambient quiet of a dinner conversation pausing naturally, but the specific, heavy quiet of 200 people sensing, even from several tables away, that something genuinely important had just shifted in the room. Conversations at nearby tables actually slowed, the way they do when a piece of unexpected information ripples outward faster than anyone can explain it. My mother, sitting 2 seats away, said in a small voice, "Defne, what is she talking about? What board?" I want to be honest that I had a choice in that moment, and I made it deliberately, the same way I'd made every choice across the previous decade of staying quiet. I could have downplayed it, smoothed it over, redirected the conversation back to Selin's engagement the way I'd redirected so many conversations away from myself for years. Instead, I decided that this was, finally, the room and the moment I'd been waiting for without consciously admitting I was waiting for anything. "I'm a managing partner at a private equity fund," I said calmly to the table, to my mother, to Selin, to anyone within earshot who wanted to actually listen for the first time in 10 years. "We acquire and restructure distressed businesses. One of our portfolio companies happens to have a minority stake in the parent company that owns Lale Catering, which is why my name is attached to a vendor discount on tonight's contract. I've worked in this industry for almost 9 years. I made partner 2 years ago. I've simply never found a way to explain any of this at a family dinner that didn't get talked over within 30 seconds, so at some point, I stopped trying." I looked directly at Selin. I never corrected, still figuring things out, because I genuinely didn't think it mattered what you called me at family parties, as long as I knew what I was actually building. I think I was wrong about that a little. I think it mattered more than I let myself admit, watching you say it for 10 years. Selin didn't say anything for what felt like a very long time. Her new fiancé, Barack, sitting beside her, looked between the two of us with the careful, slightly alarmed expression of a man realizing his engagement party had just become a venue for a decade of unspoken family tension to surface in front of his own parents. Eventually, Selin said, very quietly, "Why didn't you ever just tell me?" "Because you never asked," I said. "Not once in 10 years did you ask me a real question about what I actually do." You decided somewhere around when we were 22 that you already knew, and you never updated the file. I let you keep believing it because correcting you felt like it would take more energy than I wanted to spend defending myself to someone who'd already made up her mind. The silence stretched. I could hear the distant sound of music from the main room, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversations that had resumed at nearby tables, but at our table, no one seemed to know what to say. I want to pause here and explain something about silence, because I think it's the part of this story that people misunderstand most. When I say I was silent for 10 years, I don't mean that I never spoke. I spoke plenty, about books I was reading, about travel I'd done, about the weather in London, about the occasional interesting restaurant I'd discovered. I spoke about the surface-level details of my life, the easy things, the things that didn't invite uncomfortable questions. What I didn't speak about was what really mattered. I didn't speak about the deals I was working on, the companies I was restructuring, the millions of pounds moving through the funds I managed. I didn't speak about the team I led, the investors I managed, the board meetings I chaired. I didn't speak about any of it because speaking about it would have required explaining it, and explaining it would have required answering questions, and answering questions would have required either lying or revealing the full extent of what I'd built, and I wasn't ready to do either. There's something seductive about being underestimated. I discovered this gradually, over the years, the way you discover any uncomfortable truth about yourself. When people underestimate you, they don't expect anything from you. They don't ask you to perform. They don't demand explanations. They leave you alone to do your work, to build your life, to become whoever you're going to become, without the pressure of their expectations. I convinced myself for a long time that this was a gift. That Selin's dismissiveness, the family's lack of curiosity, the repeated still figuring things out comments, all of it was actually a blessing in disguise because it freed me from the obligation to explain myself, to justify my choices, to perform success for an audience that wouldn't understand it anyway. But I was lying to myself. Not completely, there was truth in the logic. But the logic was incomplete because it omitted the essential thing. I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to know. I wanted, in some deep and unacknowledged part of myself, to prove Selin wrong, to watch her face when she realized she'd made a mistake, to finally have the moment of recognition that I'd been waiting for without admitting I was waiting for anything. This is the part of the story that's hardest to tell, because it reveals something about me that I'm not entirely proud of. I wasn't just silent for 10 years out of pragmatism or professional discretion. I was silent because silence was my weapon, the only weapon I had, the only way to fight back against the narrative Selin had built around us without actually fighting at all. Let me tell you what I actually built during those 10 years of silence, because I think the specifics matter more than the general outline. I joined a boutique private equity firm in London when I was 23, fresh out of my master's program, eager and terrified and determined to prove myself. The firm was small at the time, maybe 15 people total, including the partners, and it specialized in what we called distressed asset acquisitions, which is a fancy way of saying we bought companies that other people had given up on. The work was brutal. Long hours, relentless travel, constant pressure to find deals, structure deals, close deals. I learned more in my first 2 years than I'd learned in my entire education about valuation, about negotiation, about how to read a balance sheet and understand what it was really saying. I learned how to build financial models that could predict a company's future performance with surprising accuracy. I learned how to manage teams of analysts, how to present to investors, how to handle the stress of a deal that was about to fall apart at the last minute. I learned, most importantly, how to keep going when everything seemed hopeless, when the numbers didn't work, when the counterparties were difficult, when the deal looked like it was going to collapse. I learned that persistence was the most important quality in my field, not brilliance, not connections, just the simple ability to keep showing up and keep working until the problem was solved. The firm grew. We added partners, expanded our portfolio, took on bigger deals with bigger stakes. I was promoted to senior analyst, then vice president, then partner. The promotions came faster than I'd expected, partly because I was good at my job and partly because I was willing to do the work that other people didn't want to do, the grunt work, the due diligence, the endless spreadsheet modeling that needed to be done before anyone could make a decision. By the time I was 30, I was a managing partner at a firm with over £1 billion in assets under management. I led a team of 30 analysts and associates. I sat on the boards of half a dozen companies we'd acquired, overseeing their restructuring and planning their eventual sale. I traveled constantly, flying to Germany, France, Italy, Spain, wherever the deals took me. My life was a blur of airports and boardrooms, of investor meetings and due diligence sessions, of late nights and early mornings and the constant, focused energy of building something significant. And through all of it, I was still Defne, the quiet twin, the one who was still figuring things out. The moment I told Selin and my mother and everyone else at that table what I actually did for a living, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the content of what I said, it was the fact that I was saying it at all, that I was finally letting myself be seen after all those years of comfortable invisibility. I'd convinced myself that I didn't need recognition, that I was above the petty need for validation, that I was too grown up, too mature, too focused on my work to care what other people thought. But the moment the words left my mouth, I felt something complicated and uncomfortable, a sense of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy, followed immediately by the familiar shame of wanting something I told myself I didn't need. My mother was looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time. My father had tears in his eyes, which was unexpected and deeply unsettling. Selin's fiancé was looking at me with a new respect, a new appreciation, as if I'd transformed in front of him from a family footnote into something more interesting. And Selin herself, Selin was crying. I'd never seen her cry like that. Not the performative tears she used to get what she wanted, not the emotional tears of a movie or a sentimental story, but the quiet, helpless tears of someone who had just realized she'd made a terrible mistake and couldn't undo it. She sat there, in her beautiful gown, at her beautiful engagement party, surrounded by 200 guests who were starting to notice that something was happening at the head table, and she wept like a child. I felt something shift in my chest. Not pity, exactly. I wasn't going to let 10 years of still figuring things out be erased by a few tears. But something closer to recognition. Recognition that Selin was a human being, not just a villain in my story. Recognition that she'd spent a decade building a narrative about me that made her feel better about herself, and that she was only now realizing the full cost of that narrative. The party didn't end in a scene, exactly. I want to be clear about that because I think people imagine these moments as explosive, and this one wasn't. Yasmin, mortified, apologized again, resolved the actual billing discrepancy efficiently, and the dinner service continued. Most of the 200 guests, I'm sure, simply registered it as a strange, brief moment of tension at the head table and moved on with their evening. But the conversation that actually mattered happened 3 days later, when Selin called me, alone, and asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a quiet cafe in Besiktas, a place we discovered years ago, back when we were still trying to maintain the illusion of sisterly closeness. She'd chosen it deliberately, I think because it was neutral ground, a place we'd been together before, without the pressure of family expectations. She cried almost immediately, in a way I hadn't seen from her since we were teenagers. She told me she'd spent the 3 days since the party going back through a decade of memories, replaying every single time she'd introduced me as still figuring things out, and feeling, increasingly, sick about it. She told me she didn't think she'd ever consciously decided to be cruel. She genuinely believed, until that night, the version of me she'd constructed somewhere in her early 20s and never bothered to update, because updating it would have required actually asking me a real question and sitting with whatever answer came back. I think, she said, turning her coffee cup slowly the way people do when they're working up to something difficult, I built a story about you that made me feel better about my own life. If you were the one still figuring things out, then I got to be the one who had it figured out. I never once considered that I might have just been wrong, because being wrong about that would have meant looking at my own life differently too. I told her I appreciated her saying that, and I meant it. I also told her, honestly, that I didn't think one coffee conversation undid 10 years of a nickname repeated at every family gathering, and that I needed time, real time, to see whether anything actually changed, rather than simply accepting an apology that arrived only because the truth had become impossible to avoid. She nodded, slowly, and I could see her processing this, the realization that an apology, even an honest one, wasn't enough to undo a decade of damage. She asked what I needed from her. I told her I didn't know yet. I needed to figure it out myself, and I needed her to stop assuming she already knew. It's been months since that night at the engagement party, and I want to tell you honestly how things have changed. Not the dramatic Hollywood version, but the real, messy, ordinary reality of two sisters trying to rebuild something that was broken for a very long time. Selin has started asking real questions. Not performative ones, not the kind of questions you ask to demonstrate that you're trying, but actual, curious, engaged questions about my work, about the deals I'm involved in, about what a typical week actually looks like. She asks follow-up questions. She remembers details from one conversation to the next. She's learning slowly who I actually am. She's also stopped, completely, introducing me with any version of the old phrase. At her wedding 3 months ago, a smaller, more intimate affair than the engagement party, by mutual decision, she told the room, in her own toast, that her sister was one of the most accomplished people I know, and I spent way too many years not bothering to find that out. I cried a little, I'll admit it. It wasn't the words themselves that got me. I'd heard plenty of praise from strangers and colleagues over the years. It was the fact that she was saying it in front of everyone, acknowledging publicly what she'd only recently allowed herself to see. But we're still working on it. The ease of our old relationship is gone, replaced by something more careful, more deliberate, more conscious. We talk on the phone more often now, but the conversations are different, less superficial, more meaningful, more willing to sit with discomfort. We're still figuring out what this new version of our relationship looks like, and I think that's okay. These things take time. Looking back on the 10 years of silence, I've come to understand something that I couldn't see at the time. Silence isn't a single thing. There are different kinds of silence, different ways of not speaking, and I was experiencing several of them at once. There was the pragmatic silence, the professional discretion that prevented me from discussing my work in any detail with people who wouldn't understand it anyway. This was real, and it was valid, and I don't regret maintaining that silence when I needed to. There was the protective silence, the self-preservation instinct that kept me from sharing my success with a family that had already shown they weren't interested in understanding it. This was also valid, I think, a recognition that some audiences aren't safe for certain truths, that sometimes you need to protect yourself from people who won't receive what you have to say with the care it deserves. But there was also something else, something I'm less proud of, a strategic silence, a calculated withholding of truth that was designed to maximize impact when the truth finally emerged. I didn't tell Selin what I did because a part of me wanted to watch her realize it, wanted to see her face when she understood how wrong she'd been, wanted to finally have the moment of recognition I'd been denied for years. That silence wasn't just a protection, it was a weapon, and I used it deliberately, even if I didn't fully admit that to myself at the time. I don't know if that makes me a bad person. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I still don't have a clean answer. What I know is that I made choices that had consequences and that I have to live with those consequences, just like Selin has to live with hers. I think about the story Selin told herself about me. The one where I was the quiet, unsuccessful twin. The one who is still figuring things out. And I recognize something familiar in it. It's a story that served a purpose for her, that made her life make sense in a certain way. If I was the failure, she was the success. If I was lost, she was found. If I was still figuring things out, she had things figured out. We all tell ourselves these stories, I think. We construct narratives about the people around us that make our own lives feel more coherent, more meaningful, more secure. We do it without fully realizing we're doing it, without understanding how much we're shaping reality to fit our needs. The problem is that these stories have consequences. They don't just stay in our heads, they shape how we treat people, how we talk to them, how we think about them. Selin's story about me affected how she introduced me to people, how she talked about me behind my back, how she related to me in our private conversations. It affected our mother, who absorbed Selin's version of events and repeated it back to relatives. It affected my father, who worried about me more than he needed to because he'd absorbed the story of my failure.
And it affected me.
I can't pretend that 10 years of being introduced as still figuring things out didn't leave marks. I can't pretend that I didn't internalize some of that I didn't sometimes wonder in dark moments whether Selin might be right, whether I was actually as impressive as I thought I was, whether I was just fooling myself. This is the thing about stories. They become true if you tell them enough times, even if they weren't true to begin with. When people talk about being recognized, they usually mean something positive, being seen, being understood, being appreciated for who you really are. And it is positive mostly. It's validating and satisfying, and if I'm being honest, deeply pleasurable, in a way that's hard to admit because it feels so petty. But recognition is also complicated and heavy and sometimes painful. Because once people see you clearly, they also see the things you've hidden, the things you've been protecting, the ways you've been holding yourself back. And you can't control what they do with that knowledge. After the engagement party, things changed with my family in ways I hadn't anticipated. My mother, who'd never shown much interest in my work, suddenly wanted to know everything. She wanted details about my salary, my investments, my living situation. She wanted to meet my colleagues, see my office, understand the full scope of what I'd built. It was overwhelming, honestly, because I'd spent a decade being invisible and suddenly I couldn't get enough visibility. My father, who'd always believed in me even when he didn't fully understand what I was doing, started talking about me with a new pride, a new willingness to share my achievements with anyone who would listen. It was nice, I guess, but it also felt a little late, a little reactive, a little like he was making up for lost time. And Selin, well, Selin was the most complicated of all. She wanted to make amends, clearly, but she also seemed uncertain how to do it, how to relate to me now that the old story had been demolished. We had conversations that were stilted and awkward, conversations where we both tried too hard to be understanding and ended up talking past each other. We had conversations that were easier, more relaxed, where we found the old connection we'd shared before all the complications and resentments had built up between us. I didn't know what to do with any of it. I still don't, sometimes. There's a strange comfort in being misunderstood, in knowing that you're not fully seen, that people don't really know who you are or what you're capable of. I discovered this during the years of silence, learned to cultivate it, almost to depend on it. When people misunderstand you, they don't expect anything from you. They don't ask you to perform. They don't demand explanations. They leave you alone to do your work, build your life, become whoever you're going to become without the pressure of their expectations. It's a kind of freedom to be invisible, a freedom to operate without constraints, to develop at your own pace, to become who you're going to become in your own time. But it's also a cage, because being misunderstood means being alone. It means carrying everything yourself, without the comfort of being seen, without the support of being understood. It means knowing that no one really knows who you are and that you might never be fully known. I didn't realize how lonely I was until the night of the engagement party, when Selin looked at me with new eyes and suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore. It was overwhelming to be seen, but it was also a relief, a release from the long burden of carrying everything alone. I still don't know exactly where this story is going. The engagement party was months ago, and Selin and I are still figuring out what our relationship looks like now that the truth has been revealed. Some days are easy, some are hard. Some days we laugh together like we used to, and some days we sit in awkward silence, both of us aware of the distance between us. I've started telling my family more about my life, not everything because there are still things I need to keep private, but more than I used to. I talk about my work sometimes, about the deals I'm working on, about the challenges and frustrations of my job. They don't always understand what I'm talking about. The world of private equity is complex, and I still haven't found a good way to explain it to people who aren't in the business. But they're trying. They're listening. They're asking questions. And that matters more than I thought it would. I've also started thinking differently about silence. It's not that I regret being silent. I did what I needed to do, made choices that made sense at the time, built a life that I'm proud of. But I've started to understand that silence isn't always a protection. Sometimes it's a barrier, something that keeps you separate from the people who might actually want to know you. And sometimes it's just unnecessary, a habit you've developed that doesn't serve you anymore, a pattern you keep repeating even though you've outgrown it. If I could go back to that night, I think I'd do it the same way. I wouldn't have corrected Selin earlier. I wouldn't have explained myself before I was ready. I would have let the moment build, let the truth gather its weight, let it land with the impact it deserved. But I also think I would have felt something different in the moment. Not just the satisfaction of being seen, but also something more complicated, A recognition that I'd been waiting for this moment for years, that I'd arranged things unconsciously, partly so that it would happen exactly this way, and that waiting for a moment of triumph is not the same as living a life. The night of the engagement party, after Yasmin's gasp and the silence and the revelation, I sat at that table surrounded by 200 people who'd just learned something new about me. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was actually present, actually there, actually existing in the moment rather than just going through the motions. It was terrifying, honestly. To be seen that clearly, to be known that completely, to have all the careful scaffolding of my invisibility torn away in front of everyone I was trying to protect myself from. But it was also freeing. A release from the burden of pretending. This story doesn't have a neat moral. I'm not going to tell you that being underestimated is secretly a gift, or that staying silent will eventually lead to triumph, or that confronting family members is always the right thing to do. Those are all ideas that sound good in theory but fall apart in practice, because real life is messier than that. What I can tell you is that silence is a choice, and it has consequences. It can protect you, but it can also isolate you. It can give you freedom, but it can also trap you in a version of yourself that doesn't fully exist. It can be a weapon, but weapons cut both ways. I can tell you that family stories are powerful and that they're hard to change once they've taken hold. Selin's story about me, the one where I was the quiet, unsuccessful twin, served a purpose for her, and it served a purpose for our family. It made things simple. It made things easy. It made everyone feel like they understood the world, understood who we were, and what we were about. But simplicity and ease aren't the same as truth, and sometimes you have to disrupt the comfortable story to find something real. I can tell you that recognition is a double-edged sword. When people finally see you clearly, they see everything, your triumphs and your failures, your strengths and your weaknesses, the things you're proud of and the things you're not. Being seen is a gift, but it's also a demand, because once you're seen, you can't go back to being invisible. You have to live with the reality of who you really are, without the protection of being misunderstood. And I can tell you that relationships are complicated, and that they take work, and that sometimes the work is worth it. Selin and I are still figuring out our relationship, still learning how to be sisters in a new way, still finding our footing after the earthquake of that night. It's not easy. Some days I wonder if we'll ever get back to the place we were before, and other days I realize that we're building something new, something that might be better in the long run. Selin's wedding was 3 months after the engagement party. She asked me to be her maid of honor, and I said yes. Not because I'd forgiven her completely, but because I was learning that forgiveness isn't a single event. It's a process, something that happens gradually over time through 100 small decisions to keep showing up for each other. The wedding was smaller than the engagement party, intimate by our family standards, with maybe 60 guests instead of 200. Selin chose a venue that overlooked the sea, and the ceremony was held at sunset, with the water turning gold and pink behind the couple as they made their vows. I gave a toast, because that's what maids of honor do. I talked about growing up with Selin, about the years of rivalry and competition and misunderstandings, and about the journey we'd been on to find our way back to each other. I talked about how sisters can hurt each other in ways that no one else can, but also how they can heal each other if they're willing to do the work. I spent a lot of years being the quiet sister, I said, looking out at the room full of family and friends. The sister who didn't have much to say, who kept to herself, who seemed to be drifting through life without any clear direction. And some of that was true. I am quiet, I do keep to myself. But the part about drifting through life without direction was a story that other people told about me, and that I let them tell because I didn't know how to stop it. I paused, looking at Selin. She was crying again, the way she'd cried at the engagement party, but this time it was different. Less about shame, more about hope. The night of the engagement party, I finally let the truth come out. I continued. Not because I planned it, but because it was time. And since then, Selin and I have been learning how to be sisters in a new way, a way that's more honest, more open, more willing to see each other clearly. It's not always easy, but it's real, and I'm grateful for it. I raised my glass. To Selin and Barak. May your marriage be built on truth, not stories. And may you always see each other clearly, even when it's hard. The room applauded, and Selin hugged me tightly, and I felt something shift in my chest, a release, finally, of the resentment I'd been carrying for so long. It wasn't gone completely, and I don't think it ever will be. But it was smaller now, quieter, less important than the relationship we were building. I'm writing this from my flat in London, looking out at a gray sky and the familiar rooftops of the city I've called home for almost 10 years. My career is still going strong. We've closed 3 new deals in the past 6 months, and I'm in the process of hiring 2 new associates to manage our growing portfolio. My life looks much the same as it did before the engagement party on the surface. But underneath, everything has shifted. I talk to my family more often now. My mother calls me every Sunday, and we've started having actual conversations, the kind where she asks questions and actually listens to the answers, where she shares things about her life that she used to keep private. My father and I have been working on a small investment project together, something that's given us an excuse to talk more regularly about things we both care about. And Selin is still a work in progress. We call each other twice a month, sometimes more, and we're slowly rebuilding the connection we'd lost. It's not the same as it was when we were children, and it probably never will be. But it's something real, something honest, something built on a foundation of truth rather than stories. I've also started being more open with other people, friends, colleagues, acquaintances. I've stopped hiding behind the easy answers and the comfortable evasions. I've stopped letting people underestimate me, stopped letting them fill in the blanks with their own stories about who I am and what I'm capable of. It's harder, being seen. It requires more energy, more vulnerability, more willingness to risk being judged or misunderstood. But it's also more honest, and honesty has a weight that I'm learning to carry. I think about that night in the ballroom often, the gasp, the silence, the moment of recognition that changed everything. I think about the 10 years of silence that preceded it, the careful architecture of invisibility I built without quite realizing I was building anything at all. And I think about what I've learned from all of it. That stories are powerful, but they're not the truth. That silence can protect you, but it can also trap you. That recognition is a gift, but it's also a responsibility. And that relationships are complicated and take work, and sometimes the work is worth it. I don't have all the answers. I'm still figuring things out in my own way, but I'm figuring them out honestly now, without hiding, without the comfortable shelter of being misunderstood. And that's a start, at least. If you've made it this far, thank you for reading my story. It's not a simple one, and it doesn't have a neat ending, but it's mine, and I'm proud of it. If you want more stories like this, please subscribe and share. I post twice a day, every single day, and I promise the next one will be just as revealing. And if you've ever been underestimated, ever been the quiet one in a family of loud voices, ever been told you weren't enough until you proved them all wrong, I'd love to hear your story in the comments.